Warning! Tube amplifiers have lethal voltages inside them. Please do not attempt to build, test, or repair these without understanding and following all safety protocols. Hey y'all! Well, we're going to do probably a pretty long series of videos about building this Elekit TU-8888 push-pull monoblock amplifier. I'm not going to talk about critiquing anything in this series. We're just going to be building it. So let's get busy putting this thing together. So we got this 550 volt 120 UF cap that goes here, and I thought the camera was running, but it wasn't. But you want to come in here and get the solder joint and then push down on the board like this while you heat the solder joint back up and make sure that the cap's flush up against the board, just like that. So then we have these 500 volt 10 UF caps. There's 3 of these, and they go in C4, C14, and C15. So C4, C14 are both over here. Again, long lead in the positive, the lead in the negative. Make sure the little quarter moon lines up with the negative. Bend that guy over. Same thing here. And one thing that's helpful too that I noted is it looks like they've got all the negatives facing in that direction. So that helps make sure that you've got the orientation right. And then C15 is the last of these 500 volt guys, which makes sense. They're all over here as part of the power supply. And then we've got these 10 UF 200 volts. And that is C7, C8, and C17. And they're all over here in this corner over here. And those 3 guys sit over there with the negative in the same orientation as all the other caps. The only one that's different is this big guy, and the negative points to this heat sink. All the other caps, as you can see, the negatives are all facing towards the front of the board. So that's kind of helpful to make sure you got everything oriented correctly as a double check. So let me solder these caps in, and I believe there may be a few other little small ones up here in the front, but we'll do those in just a minute. And then finally, in yet another bag, are these 3 capacitors. Again, I'm gonna keep complaining about this, that like when you've got a step in the instructions that have a dozen capacitors, they really shouldn't be spread across 3 different bags of parts with other stuff. It just makes it unnecessarily difficult to find the stuff to install. And these are 220 UF 16 volts, and they go C9, C10, C11. So there's C11, there's C9, C10. And I will say I like that they have the board designed so that all the negative sides of these filter caps point in the same direction, so that it's easy to double check your work looking through and just see that, yep, all of them are facing the same direction, and that then you know that you've put the caps in the right orientation. So let me solder these 3 guys in, and we'll move to our next step. Okay, so we have these little guys soldered in the front, and at this point you want to look at the board. The only bare gold you're going to see is like around these little pots, and the rest of it should be all filled in. And just look over the board, make sure you're not missing any parts. As you can see, every little solder blob is filled in. There's no blank gold at this point. And we've completed the main board. So now we need to finish up the little subboards that we started working on, some of them. And let's go in here and mark off all of our capacitors. Just, we've been pretty good about coming by and making sure that everything is put in and double checked. So the one board we didn't work on yet is the input board, which is where the RCA jack connects. And you can install the potentiometer if you want to have an input pot. And it goes right here. And then you put a little strap over it. We're not going to be installing that. I'm going to be putting a solder blob across this little point here, which jumpers the potentiometer so that it's just a direct input. And honestly, I just don't really see the value in having a potentiometer on the back of the amplifier. But maybe somebody wants to be able to adjust the input sensitivity. Possibly there's a reason somebody would want to do that. So anyway, RCA jack snaps in there. Really difficult to install that incorrectly. Again, this is not something I would really skimp on the solder, because you're going to be plugging and unplugging stuff into this. Even though it is screwed to the back of the chassis, you don't want to be troubleshooting in the future why the amp doesn't make any sound, because you've got an open solder joint on this little RCA jack to the board. And if you wanted to, you could install like a really nice RCA jack on the back of the board and leave this board out and just run jumper wires up to this A and B on the main board. That's an option. And possibly, you know, in a kind of an upgrade you could do. But I'm just going to use this little jack because it seems decently made, and it's a lot simpler to just screw this thing to the board. So then we need to find, there's, in a different bag, here's the screws that hold this board in place. And then there's 4 screws left in this bag. 3 of these go to hold these boards together. And then the final screw holds the RCA jack to the chassis. So come in here and take our main board. And I believe this sits on top like that. The jack's going to be on the underside of the board like that. And take these 3 screws and screw these 2 boards together. And then before you tighten these up, find one of the thicker leads off of one of the capacitors. You bend it in a U shape like that, and you put it through like that, and then it's also coming through on that side. And then you come in and solder it on both sides, and that's connecting the input signal from this little subboard to the main board. You get a nice solder blob like that, and make sure that it's also soldering to the pad and it's not just soldering to the wire, because obviously this needs a really good connection, because this is where the input signal goes between the 2 boards. The only reason I can think that they manufactured it like this was that they envisioned that there would be people that would want to use a much higher quality RCA jack, and this allows you to do that. So let me get this other side soldered up. And solder this other side, and then we'll just double check these screws are nice and snug. You don't need to super tighten them where you're going to strip out the board that these are threading into, because they're self-tapping screws. And there we go. Now we've got the little jumper that we've done to eliminate the potentiometer, and we got the RCA jack installed. So let's finish up this power supply board, and the only thing we have left is we need to install this guy. And let's take this fuse out, because that's not the fuse we're going to be using. Okay, so we want to put this IEC connector. You want it like that, where this is flush with the bottom of the board. And then finally, there's this little RE1201 spark arrestor, which I use a similar kind of capacitor thing across the switch contacts so that the amplifier doesn't pop when you turn it off. And that's what this little guy is doing. And so let's solder this little unit on. And be careful, it looks exactly like some of those little film caps. And those are a very different little device. Don't get them mixed up. So that completes our power input board. Just like that. Okay, so the assembly we've got to do is the bias meter. And we're going to be putting these 2.2K resistors. And I've checked the set of them here. Got 3 that are good. And then we're going to install these LEDs, and then we're going to put the meter on the board. So we're going to put these resistors on the board first, since these are the least heat sensitive thing. And then you have to put the LEDs in next and the meter last, because the meter goes over the top of the LEDs, and that's what illuminates the meter. And it also acts as the power indicator. There's no like power indicator light on this amp, and these LEDs on the meter kind of function as that indicator that the amp is powered up, other than the tubes glowing. But sometimes that's hard to see, and you would definitely be able to see the meter lit up. So I'm going to solder these 3 resistors in place. Okay, then the instructions explain the A is the anode lead, and that's marked on the board, and it's also got a flat on the LED that aligns with the flat on the board. But if you just put the longer lead where it says A, everything will be good. And these are absolutely directional. If you put these in backwards, they just won't light up. Now I would spread these pins apart pretty far and start on this end, because you can see they're real close together there in the center, and you do not want to bridge, well, you don't want to bridge any traces, but these would be especially easy to bridge. Now we kind of push down on the board, make sure they're seated, and then there's that one. Yep. And the meter on this amp is reading continuously. On my amps, the little switch I use has a center off, so the meter only is reading when you're actually checking it, but I'm sure it's fine. Just like it is. There we go. Make sure the flats are all like in the right side. So those are installed correctly. And then we have our meter here. And I would get some sort of cloth or something to put on your table so you don't scratch that up. That would be real easy to scratch up the face of that, which would be quite ugly. And it's a little tricky. You want to make sure you get this thing as square as you can to this board, and then try to get this where it's sitting flush. But in a second I'll show you one final little trick that I did that's not in the manual, but I think it makes it a better construction. Solder this guy on just like that, and then try to get it as square as you can get it on this little board, like that. Oh, and then cut this off. Like that. And then, like I said, get it as square as you can. And then I used my hot glue gun and put a little hot glue between the meter and the board to hold it in place. And make sure it's nice and parallel and square, because I noticed it kind of just flopped around a little bit even with it soldered in place. And while I'm sure it's fine just soldering it on, if you got a hot glue gun, or you could come in with some silicone or some Gorilla Glue or whatever and just kind of attach it to that board, and then while it's drying, make sure it's nice and square on the board, and then it's not going anywhere. See, it's nice and solid. So we're ready to start assembling this thing, and the next step is going to be attaching this board to the main board, and it both mechanically and electrically is connected between the two with the standoffs. And so we have this little bag of standoffs here, and they're actually all in the same bag. Imagine that. You're tired of listening to me complaining about that. So the trick is going to be that this comes in from the back side of the board, right? And so the standoffs are going to be on this front side, and so you get some 3mm screws, and you do want to make sure you get these tight, because not only is this the mechanical connection, it's also the electrical connection. Let me get that rag back while we're working on this so we don't scratch this thing up. So you want to use pretty short screws because they got to come in from both directions. Okay, thought we were recording, but looked up and for some reason it didn't start recording. But anyway, we got the standoffs attached to this meter, which you can see they're back behind there, and made sure we held them with a little wrench or a pair of pliers, or some vice grips or something, so that you can get these screws like extra tight. And once you get those tight, same thing, you tighten up the front ones, put something like this behind the board so that you can really push down on these screws so the screwdriver doesn't pop out of these Phillips slots. And then the final thing we're putting in is this little tactile switch, and make sure it's seated all the way up against the board. And we're doing this last, so now we got a little protection from the meter so that thing doesn't get broken off while we're working on this board. And we're getting ready to install this in the chassis. The only thing left we have to do is install our coupling caps. And so we're going to come in here and finish soldering at this little switch in. Now if you've got the regular kit or you get it without capacitors and you just want to use the ones that come in the board, it comes with some caps, little box caps that you can solder right in there, and those are going to be your coupling caps. And then there's another one here, and we're actually going to be using Mundorf coupling caps, which are my personal favorites. Now it does have the outer and inner marked on these boards. On a Mundorf cap, this end towards the M is the outer, and that's the inner. And so I'm actually going to be putting these on the back side. And so let's orient ourselves. This is the inner, so we want to put them like this direction, but I'm going to turn them so the name of the cap is facing up. And I'm going to get my little needle nose pliers. Now you do need to be careful with these caps. I sold someone a phono stage kit and supplied a set of these capacitors, and they twisted the cap and broke it off inside the capacitor and ruined them. And I think they like soldered them in place and then tried to spin them to get the lettering up and destroyed them. So you want to make sure that you got them however you're going to orient them before you start bending the leads. And on these, get this where y'all can see what's going on. I'm going to hold it, bend that over. Let's check and see if that looks like it's going to fit in there. Yep. And then we're going to bend this other lead at 90 degrees. Now, you could just put them across this whole thing, but I'm going to use this because this and this are electrically connected. So we're just going to go from here to there. And then the capacitor leads are nice and short, because there's no reason to have them like going all the way across the amp like that and have this thing dangling in thin air. And then you'd probably really want to put some insulation over the wire, because that's going to have voltage on it. And yeah, we're just going to go to it like this. And that looks nice. Let me bend this just a little differently, like that. I think that looks nice. So I'm going to solder this side first, and we can kind of get it where it's sitting in there nice and square like that, and then solder this other side. Just like that, and then it sits like that. So here's our complete circuit board, and just spend a few minutes looking it over and make sure that all these directional ports are oriented right. Like, make sure all these negative caps or negative sides of these caps are all facing towards the front of the amplifier, which is, it makes it pretty easy to verify that you put things in right. They're all facing the same direction, even these little guys. And this one, the negative should face this. This diode needs to go, the stripe is in that direction. This diode, the stripe is in that direction. That diode, the stripe is towards the front. And then this little diode here, the stripe's towards the front. And then make sure these plus and minus on all 4 of these little bridge rectifiers match up with the front or the top indicators on the devices, and make sure they're put in right. Make sure this flat on this transistor is in the right direction. Same with this one here. Make sure that that cutout on this little IC chip is towards this side. And everything should be good, but just a good way of double checking everything in this last kind of look over before we install this thing in the chassis. And then here's our Mundorf coupling caps installed like I did there. I thought that was neater than just stretching the leads all the way across here. And again, these are going to have high voltage on them, so the less of the lead that it's exposed is better. I mean, I guess you could put a little PTFE tubing on that if you really wanted to be anal, but I don't think that's a big deal. Anyway, we're ready to put this thing into the chassis. So let me get everything set up to show you how to do that. Well, I hope you're enjoying this build series. If you are, please subscribe to the channel. Please like the video. I got this kit from Victor Kung at VK Music up in Canada. I'll put the link below. And as always, DIY audio is fun. So until the next video, have a nice day.